It's an unusual topic. I don't know how many of you know about it or have thought about it. You're all obviously interested. And I'm sure we're in for a really interesting time. So, the topic is non-state torture and violence against women and girls. And we have four really amazing speakers who take very different lines, although they're all concerned about the same topic. They're going to tell you a little bit about themselves as they talk, and we're going to do it in the order of the joint experts that you see here. Is it Jean or Jeanne? Jean. In English. Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald. They are the Canadian experts, and it's actually Linda that's going to go first. And they're both feminist activists, authors, human rights defenders, and supporters of women identifying and healing from non-state torture. So, Linda, please. Sorry.
But it's the best we can do. We're mobile crew here. Jean and I, I'll introduce us both together. I think it'll save time. We're human rights defenders, and we work with non-state torture survivors, and I'll tell you what non-state torture is first. It's torture that's perpetrated by the everyday person. That could be a parent, it could be a guardian, it could be a pimp, a John, a human trafficker, it could be a neighbor. It's someone that's not employed by the state. So it's the exact same torture that state tortures perpetrate in embassies and police or military, but it's happening in the home or in the private sphere. That's what non-state torture is. So Jean and I have been working on this issue for 21, almost 22 years now. We're from Nova Scotia, Canada, and we're members of the NGO, the Canadian Federation of University Women, who have been a great support of the work that we do. And we're lobbying for many issues around non-state torture, primarily to make it visible, and that's why we're doing these presentations so that you'll know what non-state torture is, and maybe go back to your own country and think about asking if there's laws in your country. So that's our goal.
You want me to turn it?
Yeah. So, so we start with it as non-state torture is a human rights violation. And if you look at the charter that was way back in the 1940s, you know that women had to fight to get in the charter. Women had to fight to get into the declaration. And now really women and girls who are enduring non-state torture have to fight to become recognized as visible in these charters and conventions. Because it says that men and women are equal and that no one shall endure torture. But right now, the state is recognized as a form of torture. But you probably never heard of non-state torture before, have you?
No.
Not many. So it shows how invisible it is. And we're trying to get it known that the women and girls that we're talking about, they're not no one, but that they are the persons that should not endure torture as equally as persons that endure state torture. So this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 5 does say no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. So that's our fundamental foundation for everything that Jean and I lobby for. And Article 2 says everyone is entitled to all the rights in the Convention, regardless of sex. And we're saying that it's discriminatory and that women and girls are not being recognized as being victims of non-state torture. So we're claiming Article 5, we want it in law in order to promote equality. Okay. So, if we say that non-state torture is a form of violence against women, which indeed it is, it's recognized under the Convention Against Torture. And these are the defining elements of the Convention. And the one that really fits for non-state torture is based on discrimination of any kind, including gender. Where our country, and many countries get bogged down as they think of the old way of torture, that it's to obtain confession for some kind of a military information. But that's actually this is the old definition of torture, but it was only the first obtaining information and punishment and intimidation were used. This fourth one was forgotten all the time. And so people are amazed when they see that actually that defining element of discrimination is there. And the majority of the survivors that Jean and I worked with are women. We've talked to over 4,000 women from all over the world, from North America, from the UK, from Western Europe, from Australia, New Zealand, and from the Philippines. And of course, the state knows that non-state torture is happening and they're complicit in that. So, the Committee Against Torture, there's been an evolutionary process around that. And Jean and I have been part of that process of helping to raise awareness around non-state torture in the Committee Against Torture. And Felice Gear in 2012, she was a panelist with us at one of the sessions that we did here in the UN. And she talked about the history, that really for the first 12 years of the committee, the existence of women and gender-based tortures of rape and some forms of domestic violence and human trafficking were virtually invisible. Didn't happen because they didn't talk about it. So guess who got it in that? Women. Women pushing. Women pushing. Women pushing. That's how it became visible. In 2008, the Human Rights Council, Resolution 88, on CAT, called for the Special Rapporteur on states to integrate gender violence against women. And the General Assembly, Resolution 65-205, restated its position in 2012. So you see where the UN is asking for more gender perspective on violence. And plastic torture can apply to different forms of violence against women. Manfred Nowak, he mentioned this in his report in 2008. And then he went on to support panels on acid burning, because that's recognized as a form of non-state torture, as well as FGMism. And the state's complicity or acquiescence, if the state is aware of non-state torture, that it occurs, and it's not addressed, the acts are impermissible under the committee. And that was since 2008. So we have all these realities of women that we talk to. They don't fit, they feel socially excluded, they feel stigmatized, and they feel marginalized. Because still, you're not hearing about torture in any of these sessions. You're not hearing about non-state torture as a form of violence against women on the continuum. They're still feeling that they're ostracized in some way. Now, if you look at the critique of the committee reports, you'll see a growth in that as well. In 2007, the general comment number 2 talked about state and non-state actors as perpetrators of torture and spoke of manifestations of gender-based violence. And that was really exciting to see that, because here we are, 2007. Jean and I have been doing this since 1993, and the Committee of Torture is saying, yes, indeed, non-state torture occurs, and it's as serious as state torture. Now, in concluding observations of the committee, if you look at the evolution, 2002 to 5, there was only 3 rape violations mentioned. 2006 to 7, 12 state reports cited rape. So that's where you can see the genderization of the committee. And then 2007 to 2011, 31 states mentioned sexualized violence when addressed. In 2012, as part of the NGO CFUW, CFUW submitted a shadow report on non-state torture to the committee. And indeed, the Committee Against Torture recommended our country of Canada to change the criminal code and include non-state torture as a crime. So the committee supported what we asked for, and our country said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't have to listen to the Committee Against Torture because it's not legally binding. So this is why we need legally binding documents to support women who've endured non-state torture. In 2014, there was a review, Jean did a review of 7 CAT committee concluding observations, and she did not find non-state torture anywhere, and any of the violence against women that might have been torture were subsumed to domestic violence and human trafficking. So again, we're not saying that all domestic violence is torture, but some domestic violence is, and the domestic violence that is torture should be named non-state torture to make it visible. So we'll give you a little more detail about what we're talking about with non-state torture. With state torture, they call classic torture. That's a term that the UN uses. So we use that for non-state torture. These classic forms of torture are exact same forms of torture that you'll hear about in anything from Abu Ghraib or any other state torture that you've read or heard about in the news. Remember, these are all happening to women and children in their homes or in domestic and private sphere, like a hotel or a cabin. We have electric shocking, beaten, burned, cut, whipped. All of the immobilized tortures of being tied, hung, caged, forced into very painful positions, water torture that you heard so much about with Abu Ghraib. Same thing with children and women, only they use a bathtub or the toilet or a bucket. You know, those are the home forms of torture. Suffocation and choking, sexualized torture, gang rape is ever present and it's ever shadowed. And that's one of the extreme sexualized tortures that women and children, little girls, go gang raping. Chemical torture, forced drugging, that's very common. Parents drug their children before they traffic them and torture them. Then they forget, and if they do tell, they get remembering of being drugged, and then their story sounds confused and they're discredited. So drugging is used for many reasons. Deprivation of food, drink, heat, cold, all the psychological torture, being told that they're nothing and nobody, everything is their blame. Animalization, they're forced into bestiality. Necrophilia, forced nakedness. Witnessing the torture of other children or women. Being powerless. And the ritualisms that heighten the pleasure of the torture. People always ask us, why do the torturers do what they do? They always do it for pleasure, for profit, and for power. And people mostly forget the pleasure. It's hard for any good person to understand why anybody would want to harm an innocent child or a woman. But if you're from the other side of the continuum of a value system, that you feel that you're superior and that you have the ultimate right, you have great pleasure in harming vulnerable people. Then there's two other forms. There's the social, cultural norms and religious-based acts such as FGM. We all know about that now. At one time that was not a visible form, but from all the work that the women activists have done, it is now visible. Acid burning and widow burning. And then we have the commercial-based torture, which is the trafficking, torture and prostitution. We've had many women contact us who have endured some forms of non-state torture and prostitution. All the same listed here, remember? All the same. That's why Jean and I are of the opinion that prostitution is not sex work. It's a form of violence against women. And I always say to people, torture is not work. And then there's torture porn, snuff films. You know what a snuff film is?
No.
Yeah, some do. Some don't. It's when they actually murder somebody and they film it. And they go in a very high price. They're sold very profitable, and children witness this, and women. And then the migrant domestic workers. So we have examples of a woman in my country of Canada, Jane Hirschman. These are all the things that happened to her. She was severely beaten, stripped naked, pubic hair yanked out, gagged with soiled panties, forced bestiality. Jane then eventually committed suicide because she just didn't have enough support. And she was not recognized as a torture survivor in our country. And then a woman in Michigan, she was blind, diabetic. Her husband, he drugged her, or gave her insulin, put her into insulin shock, and then put a plastic bag over her head and made her go unconscious, and then raped her and videoed it. And that's why they changed the law in Michigan, because of that case. These are examples of domestic torture for workers and for maids. This is a woman in 2003. She was beaten with iron bars and wooden sticks, stripped naked, gang raped again. Very common gang rape. Middle Eastern domestic worker. And then Sahar was from Afghanistan. She was held captive in a basement toilet, and she was tortured by her mother-in-law and her husband. Her fingernails pulled out, her hair pulled out, electric shock, all the same atrocities. So you might hear those stories in the news and not name them as non-state torture. Now we're asking you, think about those and think that they're the same atrocities that we recognize in state, and that women and children need to have the recognition of the crimes they're enduring. I think this is the last one for me. Women we support, they have multi-forms of classic torture, the human trafficking, I talked about that, forced prostitution, sexual exploitation. They're conditioned to train to commit suicide. They're actually taught how to do suicide in case they get the urge to tell. And that we're going to talk about on Wednesday as a form of femicide. It began in infancy for most of the women that we work with. Remember that if you've been tortured since infancy, it's very hard to tell your story because you're disassociated and it takes a lot of work to become connected. We need a lot of support, social support. So that's what we're trying to do, is create an awareness so that if you can listen to these stories, you can help many women and children. So they feel very silenced, just like this drawing of a woman from Canada. She has her mouth all stitched up because she still doesn't feel that people are hearing her. And that's why we're here. So the next person we have, you're very privileged to be